Hi, guys. Today I've got the great pleasure of introducing and interviewing a good friend of mine. Her name is Yates. Her full name is J.A. Yates. She's a crime writer and criminologist, and she's written a few books, and she's done all kinds of wonderful things. I call her Yates, and I forget that she has a first name because she's always Yates to me. But today she's actually talking about a book that hasn't been written and published yet. She's actually in the process of doing a Kickstarter campaign about it. And we've got about 3 weeks before her Kickstarter runs out. It sounds like an interesting book. A lot of history gets regurgitated, and over time, the information gets misconstrued, would be a good way to say it. And this is one of the stories that she has come across that seems to be a lot of misinformation about. And then, of course, she likes to deep dive, and she's a massive researcher. So she has got all kinds of good information about this story. And so I wanted to share it with you, my audience. And if you feel so inclined, check out our Kickstarter and help crowdfund this. It sounds like an interesting book if you are into this topic. Hi, Yates. Thanks for being with us.
Hey, Cantrell, what's happening?
Doing pretty good. Okay, so tell everybody the name of your book, the title of it. I will edit in some pictures as we go so they can see it. But tell us who this book is about, and we'll start out from there.
Okay, well, the book is called Irma Grese, Becoming the Hyena of Auschwitz, because the prisoners in Auschwitz called her the hyena. That's for several different reasons, which I cover in the book. But her name is Grese, and she was born at or around October the 7th, 1923. She was hung on December 13th, 1945. She was the youngest person to be hung at that time in English law. And she was one of the youngest people to be a guard at Ravensbrück, Auschwitz, and the women's section of Bergen-Belsen concentration camps during World War II and Nazism.
And you clarified some things for me before, so because I had never heard of this person. I haven't studied, Nazism that much. I know the basics, and then beyond that, it's not my field of study. So I classed this woman as like, okay, so she's a vicious Nazi, and you said yes, but no. If Nazism was a mindset, she qualifies, but she's not technically a Nazi. Would you explain that to the audience?
Absolutely. Okay. Nazism was a man's world because women had a certain role in society, and it certainly wasn't to fight in the war or be a guard in a concentration camp. However, we'll stay with the basics here. Women weren't allowed to be Nazis. They weren't allowed in that group simply because they were females. They were helpers, and that's what they were called, these female guards in the camps. They were considered helpers. Now, does that mean they weren't Nazis? Well, as you said, technically they were not, but work-wise, they were. Yeah. They had the same mindsets. They had the same idealism. They went by the same doctrine. So if we're looking at the umbrella of Nazism, she definitely was, but technically she was not.
Yeah. Now, I think that's something that the people don't understand, because if you haven't studied Nazism, but that, to me, that's interesting. Even in something so vicious, women still weren't allowed to be a part of it.
Correct. And what's interesting is Grese was awarded a medal while she worked in the camps for her viciousness, as it comes down to, is how vicious she was and how well she did her job, which obviously was tormenting and hurting people. So she was given that award, which, by the way, I have the photo in the book, and I have a photo of me holding an award exactly like the one that she was given. Mm-hmm. So she did the same work. She guarded the camp. She made sure that work crews went out. She was terribly abusive, and at least two points in her life, in her career, her supervisors had to stop her from being so vicious. So consider this, that here's this female in a concentration camp that has to be corrected and told, stop being so vicious and cruel.
So you have a Nazi officer getting onto someone being, she was so vicious, she was actually getting corrected by someone who was vicious.
Yes.
So that's crazy.
It's very strange, but.
So tell us, I know you and I have talked about it, but tell us, how did you get involved in this story? What brought you to this person?
Dr. Henry Lee invited me to a conference in China. It was a crime conference, and they were calling for a submission for papers. I've always been interested in the case, and I'll discuss that in a minute. I have a very dear friend who was a survivor. So I started looking into the Irma Grese case, and the further I looked, the more interested I became, submitted the paper, and like everything I get into where I say I have an idea, and it's usually very dangerous, I had an idea, and it turned into a book.
Mm-hmm.
Secondly, as I said, I had a dear friend that was a Holocaust survivor, and she was actually in a work camp in Siberia. She survived that. She became an activist in Nashville, Tennessee, and that's how we met.
Uh-huh.
She's passed now for several years, but I also did the book in memory of her.
That's great. Now, just reading through here, it said she was one of the most feared females in Nazi Germany. What did she do that made her so terrifying? What did she do? I mean, we class all Nazis in together. They all hated Jewish people. They all tortured and killed Jewish people. We have the basic concept. But then you take it a step further, and she said there was times where she was even too much for the basic concept of what we think a Nazi is. What gave her this, and why do you think she was this way? Do you find that there's any, we always want to try to say, well, maybe she had childhood trauma, or
Right.
What made her so sadistic? Do you know, or is there any evidence to show what created this? Or you think it was, that nature versus nurture argument in psychology? Do you think she was born this way?
From the time that, she was born into the period of World War II and Nazism, and it's very convoluted. I go over it in the book, but literally from going into school, she was surrounded by this ideal. Now, you have to look at the big picture, though. Not all women in Germany followed the Nazi idealism, okay?
Right.
A very small portion of women even applied to work in the camps, and then to where they eventually had to recruit people forcefully.
Mm-hmm.
And even a smaller amount of those guards and people that worked in the camps themselves were considered cruel and frightening. So she was really one of a very, very small percentage.
Mm-hmm.
Two, she was also known for her looks. She was a very attractive woman.
Mm-hmm.
For example, the uniform that these females wore were very sexless and basic, which is exactly Hitler's idealism for that. And she would have her uniforms trimmed and adjusted. Her hair was always immaculate. Her makeup was always immaculate. Her uniform fit her. And so she was just very concerned about how she came across and how she looked and how she carried herself.
Mm-hmm.
Yet she had no qualms about just turning around and shooting someone in the head, or beating them until they could no longer stand. Or she would stand in line at what they called selections and either select people for the gas chamber, or with, for example, Dr. Mengele, he would select someone and she would say, no, don't take that one, take the next one.
So she had that much power, even though she was a woman, that she could say life and death over somebody.
Oh yeah, definitely. And she did.
Mhm.
and she could shoot someone without blinking twice or beat them down. She had a specially made whip for the purpose of not just hurting someone when they were whipped with it, but what's the very hurting someone,
Right.
just atrocities.
Mhm.
Now, not a lot is truly known about her except for what survivors will say and what she testified in
Mhm.
the trial, which isn't much because she considered herself innocent
Mhm.
and she was just a psychopath. She could
Mhm.
lie and she would lie to your face, and she did it all the time in the courtroom.
Mhm.
So, what created her? Well, that's what I'm looking at in this book.
Mhm.
And so much information about her out there is just copy paste,
Mhm.
regurgitated, and there's no research to back it up per se. A lot of it is just taken from each other, and
Right.
that's where I wanted to go with it. I wanted to say, okay, why was she like this? What was her life like? What was her everyday life like? What her childhood was like? Who were her friends?
Mhm.
Uh, Everything in a person's environment. You said nature versus nurture. There's no
Mhm.
such thing.
Mhm.
Everything is nature and
It's
nurture
blend.
altogether.
It's
Hmm.
blended together.
Oh,
But if you want
definitely.
to get into the study between psychopathy and sociopathy, there's a difference. One is more created and one is more born that way. One is more hardwired and one is more nurture. And so if you want to study between the two of those, but then you also have to take into the fact that, like you said, she was born into a world that this ideal was not just accepted. It was pushed on people, and it was, in her reality, it was the truth. and
Correct.
and so that automatically blends into the nurture side of things. And so, but there's something within a person that makes them sadistic. And when you're talking about sadism, that is someone who gets off and enjoys causing pain in others or seeing others in pain. And when you get into the sadism side of things, it seems like that is more of a hardwiring issue. And so, to me, when you get into that argument of nature versus nurture, that it's so convoluted, there's so much of both in every situation that it's almost an individual case with every single person. So, and is there a lot available on her childhood? I mean, because if you don't know her childhood, it's hard to go back and label her sociopath versus psychopath, because they're so similar. But most of them, the main difference between the two is one is a chemical thing or a hardwiring, and the other one is all nurture. So it's hard to distinguish between those two. Even for professionals who've spent 30 years studying those things, and it's almost impossible, I think, if you don't know a childhood experience. But there's a level of sadism in this person that seems like is abnormal, even for Nazis. Because you said that there was people that would actually get onto her because she was even too intense for someone that we would say is, is a psychopath, and yet she's even a step further. Do you think
Yes,
part of that came from her being a woman trying to prove herself
I
in a
do.
world of men?
I do. I think that's part of it. And, I've interviewed and I'm continuing to interview professionals in the field. And with what little we have to work with, we've discussed it to find out what happened with her. But I do believe that that had something to do with it. That's one of the things I discussed.
Right.
Is, here she is. She's literally in a man's world. She had a father that was either abusive and an alcoholic, or just a very taciturn, stern man
Right.
who ran his house just so.
Right.
In
But that's
in
typical for that time period.
Mhm. And
Yeah.
in 1936, when she's preteen, her mother committed suicide. So one of the things that I am investigating is I'm trying to find as much as I can about her childhood, which is difficult because obviously there were no keeping of diaries, and
Right.
she came from a medium to lower socioeconomic status in a very small village. So
Mhm.
there's just not a whole lot. Now she did have a sister that was interviewed, but you really have to question what the sister said because she made everything sound so wonderful and happy. And of course, she was convinced that Grese was innocent of all charges. And so she was doing everything she could to make Irma look good.
Right.
But nonetheless, so I'm talking to professionals in the field for their opinions, their thoughts on the case, what created her mentally. And there's just, there's never a one reason why someone is bad. Never.
Right.
But we have her being a female in a world of men. Okay, well, she came from a world of men where her father was either the alcoholic or the stern man who had to have everything just so. Then she went into a world, she left school at 14, which was the norm. She goes into this world where she can't really get a good job to sustain herself. She goes to work at a hospital because her big dream is to become a nurse. Well, for whatever reason, she can't become a nurse. So then she decides, well, wait a minute, what about these camps? And there we have it. Who would have known? Who knows what would have happened had she really gotten her job as a nurse, which was her dream job?
Right. Well, and to me, this is something that, you and I, we're such a step away from that world and that reality that it's hard for us to kind of comprehend. And then some of my audience might be even younger, and they have a hard time comprehending how somebody could be so vicious against another human being. But you have to understand when it comes down to the...
My phone keeps ringing.
You have to understand when it comes down to it, there's the common term of brainwashing that people like to use, but people don't understand we are constantly being programmed by what is around us, by what we're looking at, what we're listening to, what we're watching, what we're reading. The people around us that we care about, they influence us. So we're constantly being socially conditioned by those around us. And so when you take some social conditioning that is so sadistic and brutal towards one type of human being, you have to understand that there's she probably already had some kind of leniency towards brutality. She probably had some kind of hardwiring issue in her brain. You look at it, some people's amygdala is overformed, while the parts of their brain that shows compassion is smaller and lessened. She may have had some of those things already, and then that constant social conditioning over generations. We as people today, we don't understand how in depth that conditioning was. And so not to approve of anything she did. We're just trying to understand the beast, trying to understand what created this, and if for some reason there's any way possible we could ever figure it out, then perhaps we could prevent it from happening again. Is kind of, I think, where science and psychology is trying to get to. If we could ever figure out that, if we could ever find the smoking gun, we could prevent it from happening again. But let's talk about some of her victims. Do we know how many people she brutalized? Do we know how many people she killed? Do we know their names? Or has that been lost to history?
Most of it has. Now, understand, we're talking about the Holocaust. We're talking about, we have no true idea of how many lives were lost. For example, in the Jewish population, the best guess is 6 million.
Yeah.
But again, let's give or take 1 million or 2.
Right.
There was a discussion that I chased after, where at one point she was sending at least 30 people a day to the gas chambers, but there's absolutely no way to know how many people she was responsible for taking their lives. Now, that could go from sending someone to the gas chamber to beating someone so viciously that they can't get up. She walks off, that person goes to the hospital there at the camp and eventually dies. So, we have this wide range of how she would commit murder.
Right. So let me ask you this: how long was her stay at this concentration camp? How long did she work there? Do we know that?
Yes. Well, she applied when she was 17 and she was told to come back when she was 18, which
Okay.
she did. And then when she was tried and convicted, she was in her early 20s, 21, and murdered when she was 22. Now, we don't know her birth date for sure, but those are the time periods we're looking at. So this girl was in this world, in this environment, and doing these crimes between the ages of 19 and 21 years old.
So for 2 years, maybe possibly 2.5, something like that, she was brutalizing and killing human beings in the
Definitely.
name of in the organization she was affiliated with, even though she wasn't technically a Nazi. That's a long tag there.
What I really found interesting is even her victims said she was such a beautiful girl. She had great skin. She had beautiful, bright blue eyes, very soft, curling blonde hair.
Mhm.
She wasn't built in what we consider beautiful in this day and age,
Right.
but she was a very attractive woman.
Mhm.
And she had beautiful, perfect teeth, a great smile. And yet, here she was, for example, she's riding her bicycle through the camp, and there is a woman that's standing in the doorway watching new people being brought in from the train cars. And Grese tells her, get back in the dorm, and then pulled out a gun, shot her, and kept going. So these are some of the things that she is doing in this camp.
Well, I
And
think that goes into people think we want to create a monster out of somebody and we want to make somebody like have the Joker face, that we want to, okay, he fell into a vat of acid and his face is all twisted up, and we want to make this psychopathic monster look like what this person is on the inside, and I think that she didn't fit that, and so that kind of made it hard for people. We try to crunch everybody down into this little stereotype box when you get to these things. Monsters don't look like monsters. They
correct.
look like human beings, and sometimes that human being can be a very beautiful person. I didn't think so. It wasn't necessarily my type of good looking person, but everyone said Ted Bundy was very good looking and charismatic.
Wow.
That's what got women to do it, and then he played the helpless victim. He had a broken arm or broken whatever. And so I think that's part of the psychology of our society. We think that they have to look a certain way to be a bad guy, and that's not the way it works. And in her case, it's flat out the opposite.
Oh, definitely.
And so I think sometimes it's good for us to talk about those things, because if we're trying to educate children to to spot a bad guy or a bad girl, or somebody that's going to harm them, we need to let them know that doesn't necessarily mean they're ugly. That doesn't necessarily mean their face is all burnt with acid, and that most of the time the people that hurt you the most are the people that you wouldn't suspect. And so I think it goes back to the just to kind of make it a joke out of it. Scooby-Doo taught us that monsters were bad guys in masks, just to bring up something light. Yeah, because we're talking about such a dreadful subject, try to bring some lightness to the conversation. But, there's so much truth to that. The monsters were never actually monsters. They were human beings in a mask. And, that's actually a good story to teach children, that you got to pay attention.
What's interesting is during the trial, the defense attorney brought up that all of these survivors that went on the stand and spoke against her, he said, well, perhaps they're jealous because she's a good-looking woman, and so they're making this up.
Mm-hmm. So he literally tried to use her beauty as a defense mechanism.
And she made the paper, she made the headlines because she was an attractive woman, and she would play to that audience because she had told two women, she said, well, after all this is over, I'm going to be in the movies. And she says, I've lived life and I know a lot. She's 19 and a half years old when she says this.
She's taken life and she's taken a lot, but she hasn't lived life. She's
But
taken it.
she's, this
Yeah.
sociopath, this psychopath mentality
Yeah.
that,
The arrogance.
says, well, I'm going to be a movie star
Hmm.
after all this mess is over. And then even when she was arrested and she was talking to her sister, she says, well, what do you think? Will they probably give me 3 years behind bars?
The
So
arrogance. Yeah.
she's got this mindset, and of course, wanting to be this movie star and not thinking she's guilty of anything. During the trial, she would look up at the press and she would do her hair.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um,
That really feeds into the there's a 22-point questionnaire that you have to rate someone on to tell if they're a psychopath, and one of them is their level of arrogance, and their level of lack of culpability. They never think they're guilty of anything, and that tends towards the psychopathy. Shows how she ranges on that scale, because
oh, yeah.
she didn't think she'd done anything wrong, and even if she did, she thought she could get off of it because she was beautiful, and they have studies that show that it's harder for juries to actually convict a beautiful person. There's scientific studies out there that show that, and so I think stuff like this is important to talk about, because it shouldn't sway you either way. But I was talking to a friend today. People treat you different based on the way you look. If you dress up and you dress nice, you can get away with so much other crap than if you look like a bum. And obviously she used her looks to get her in places that she probably shouldn't have been.
Today's episode is brought to you by Bones Coffee Company. You can forget about boring coffee when you drink Bones Coffee. Not only do they offer a variety of flavors such as strawberry cheesecake and maple bacon, they are a family-owned company that puts great detail not only in their coffee, but in the artwork that comes on each individual bag. Bones Coffee has a coffee club that will deliver your favorite coffee to your door every month. If that wasn't enough, they also have some amazing swag to offer. Check out Bones Coffee Company today. I'll have my affiliate links in the show notes for you.
Okay, so let's talk about this book. This book, the reason why you're crowdfunding it, because it's not just a little normal paperback that you can just print on demand and get. You're wanting to do something specific with this. So this is your chance to tell the audience why it's important for them to jump on this, and why it's important to get this book out.
Well, what's special about this book is it features, now I've got maybe over 120 images, and that's photographs, documents, artwork, maps, you name it, and it's in this book. I'm very proud of that because I did decide to go with color pictures. I think the color photos tell far more. It fleshes out the story. Now, obviously, not all of the photos are going to be in color because of the age and the time. None of these photos are colorized. They're the actual color photographs. For example, I had already said I have a photo of me holding the award, the medal, that is just like the one that Irma Grese was awarded. I've talked to survivors. I've talked to their families. I have interviewed, I don't know how many people at this point, professionals in the business. I have been assisted by museums, memorials, libraries, literally across the globe in this venture. And some of these images and a lot of the information is either rarely known or rarely seen. And I'm very proud of that because I'm not going to regurgitate the information. I'm not going to say what I think happened or what might have happened as fact. If it's a maybe, it's stated as such. But, you have to think how many crime books actually have the color photographs in them. So, and I thought I would do a crowdfunding for something different. I'm a self-publisher, after a lot of, well, that's another story, but I'm a self-publisher and I wanted to do this book myself. I wanted to do a quality book in the name of my friend Esther Loeb. and also for those who did lose their loved ones in the camps. Because, and I mentioned this also, there is a study, several studies that show that the children of people who survived the camps have certain personalities, have certain issues of their own.
Right.
And so it's not just about Irma Grese. It's about her environment. It's about what she did day to day. It's about her as a person, because that's how we're going to figure out, or try to figure out, who these people were. And it's just as important, you know, we have got to remember and never let go of the victims of the Holocaust.
Right.
They weren't just victims, they were people also. But if we don't actually study the people behind the scenes, we're not going to get to where, how did we get there? Red flags of getting there again,
Right.
and just having this important knowledge.
Right.
It's like any other crime. We need to
Right.
know what happened so we can
Right.
prevent it in the future.
Right. It's the reason why we study history, because history is going to just keep going over and repeat this cycle over and over again. If we don't study it, learn it, figure out what we did wrong, figure out how to, you know, change course in the middle of things, because it's just going to cycle back through and happen again if we can't study it and stop it before we get to that point again. And so I love that. And this is going to be a book that is, from what I understand on your description of it, it's actually going to be a bigger, better quality book. It's not just going to be a little paperback with a few black and white photos. It's going to be a bigger, better quality book. Sounds like it's almost going to be like a historical textbook type thing when it comes to it, because I know how you research, and you're going to put everything you got in it. You know, I've known you for a while, and you put everything you got in it, and I love that. But so anybody that's interested in crowdfunding this book, anybody that's interested in getting in on that, I believe it's first couple weeks in June when that ends. Whether you're watching this video before then or after then, I highly encourage you to find the book. What I'm going to do is I'm going to put in the video description the link to the crowdsourcing, the Kickstarter. And then after the book is published, I will go back and change the description and put the link in to buy the book. I highly encourage you to check that out if this is a subject that's interesting to you. I know some people, they're not interested in the Nazism and all that kind of things, but I know a lot of you are. And if you're a student of history, I know you need to check out this book. One last thing that I forgot to ask you: what is something you want to tell about the book that I may have not asked you?
I did a deep dive in some very different things. For example, what I kept seeing over and over and over is Irma Grese had half-starved dogs that she used to intimidate prisoners. Now, Heinrich Himmler, who ran the whole concentration camp system, he said, we have to use dogs because they intimidate, particularly women. Okay, so Irma Grese has these half-starved dogs that she's scaring these poor prisoners with. And another thing that I read is they were rabid. As a dog person, and for years, for actually my whole life, I'm thinking this doesn't sound correct. So I went to an expert dog trainer who also is learned in Schutzhund, which is the German style protection and such, and talked to them. And I said, okay, how would this work? So they gave me all kinds of information on why she could have never had half-starved dogs, and secondly, how it would have never worked if they had rabies.
Mm-hmm.
So I kind of look into some little things like that.
Right. Little details. Well, those little details can take you off on a tangent if they're wrong and get you away from the truth of the story. So I love that. And that's the way you do with all of your books. I know I've interviewed you about a couple other books. I know the one that I remember, the one that really sticks into my mind is the Bullied to Death book. And I remember we have a video on that. It's in my True Crime archives, which I was getting ready to upload again. So I will go ahead and put the links in the video description, and make sure and check out the book, crowdfund if you can. If you can't, make sure and come back to the video description and buy the book when it's done, because I have full faith that it's going to be crowdfunded and it's all going to work out. So I've got my fingers crossed for you. But you've got a good run on it so far. I mean, you've got a good run on it so far, and make sure you guys check it out, because I think we need more historically accurate books like this, so we can learn our history, not books that are regurgitated material or books that are full of propaganda to try to get you to a specific viewpoint. So make sure and check it out. Crowdfund it if you can. If you can't, make sure and come back in a month and get the link and buy the book. And I appreciate you guys. Thank you for coming on, Yates. I'll see you next time around.
I'll be there.